It's the morning of October 21st, 1966, and a really thick, wet fog has settled into the valleys of South Wales.
The kind of mist that's so dense it just, swallows the landscape entirely.
Yeah, exactly. You can't see anything. And high up on the summit of Merthyr Mountain, there's a gang of coal workers standing out in this damp chill.
Right.
And suddenly they feel the earth literally drop out from beneath their boots.
Which is terrifying because this isn't an earthquake or a slight tremor.
No.
Right.
The massive mountain of coal waste they are standing on is actively giving way. It's collapsing.
And because of that fog we mentioned, they can't actually see the village of Aberfan nestled in the valley far below them.
And they know it's there.
Oh, they definitely know it's there. And they know instantly that hundreds of thousands of tons of rock and, well, sludge, basically, are heading straight for it.
Right. Because they understand the physics of what is happening under their feet.
Yeah.
I mean, they know the mass of this thing.
Exactly. They know the trajectory. They know exactly where it's going to end up.
So panic sets in, naturally. One of the men turns, and he just sprints for the emergency telephone up at the summit.
It's really their only option, right? The only way to sound the alarm.
Yeah, to give the village even a few minutes to evacuate. So he reaches the phone, grabs the receiver, and
The line is dead.
the line is completely dead. There's no dial tone at all.
Wow.
The copper wire connecting that mountain telephone down to the village had been stolen for scrap.
And this wasn't even an isolated incident, was it?
No, not just once. It had been stolen repeatedly. And the authorities had eventually just, stopped replacing it.
They just gave up on it.
Right. So these men are standing up there in the fog, watching a mountain fall, knowing exactly who it's going to hit. And a stolen piece of wire means they cannot make a single sound to warn them.
It's really the ultimate intersection of the massive and the mundane.
That's a really good way to put it.
Yeah. I mean, you have a geological and industrial catastrophe unfolding, something so vast and it almost defies human scale, right?
Totally.
The danger was entirely known, but their ability to intervene is just completely severed by an almost pathetic failure of infrastructure.
Piece of copper wire.
Exactly. It perfectly encapsulates the compounding nature of systemic failure. The grand oversight building, a dangerous tip in the first place, is ultimately triggered into a fatal event by the most trivial of neglected details.
It's an incredibly haunting image to start with. Just a man shouting into the fog, completely unheard.
It really sets the tone.
It does. And today we are taking a deep dive into the Aberfan disaster. And to do this properly for you listening, we've pulled together a really specific stack of sources.
Right, we really wanted to get to the root of this.
Yeah. We're going through the historical tribunal reports, which I have to say are incredibly dense but deeply revealing.
Oh, very dense, but absolutely vital.
And we're looking at those alongside the actual geological surveys from the time. Plus, we're drawing heavily on the meticulous research of historians Ian McLean and Martin Jones.
Yes, their work is incredible. They spent years unearthing the unsealed archives of this event.
They really did.
Yeah.
And those sources are so crucial for our mission today. Because we aren't here just to recount a tragedy.
No, definitely not. We want to take apart the actual mechanics of how it happened.
Exactly. We need to look at how institutional negligence allowed this. And I want to be clear here, we're not talking about cartoonish malice.
Right. Nobody woke up and said, let's destroy a town today.
Exactly. It was sheer, overwhelming, bureaucratic apathy. That is what allowed a heavily documented, completely preventable disaster to occur.
And just as importantly, I think, we need to examine how the survivors were treated afterward.
Oh, man.
Because they were treated horribly by the very systems that were designed to protect them.
It's infuriating. And if you're out there wondering why a disaster from 1966 in a Welsh mining village matters to you today, it's because we all live our lives under structures we are promised are safe.
We do, every single day.
Right. We trust our power grids, we trust our bridges, we assume the zoning laws make sense.
We rely on the promise that someone, somewhere, is paying attention to the warning signs.
And Aberfan is the ultimate case study in what happens when institutions prioritize their own momentum over glaringly obvious data.
It really is. It's a story about the erosion of accountability in large systems, which is a phenomenon that is arguably more relevant today than it was back in the 1960s.
100%. So to really understand how those men on the mountain ended up with a dead phone in their hands while the ground collapsed, we really have to go back to the beginning.
We have to look at the anatomy of this trap.
Right. So let's talk about South Wales in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It was the absolute lifeblood of the British coal industry.
It fueled the empire, literally.
Literally, the Merthyr Vale colliery, which sat just down the valley from Aberfan, opened way back in 1875.
And the basic rule of coal extraction, which anyone in the industry knows, is where there is coal, there is waste.
Massive amounts of waste.
Unbelievable amounts. I mean, for every ton of usable coal hauled out of the earth, you bring up an enormous volume of useless rock, shale, slag, and this wet, fine coal mud.
Right, the slurry.
Yeah, the slurry. Collectively, all this stuff is known as colliery spoil.
Okay, so you have tons of this spoil.
Right. Now, in the steep, narrow valleys of South Wales, space is at an absolute premium.
Yeah, it's not like you have wide open plains to just dump this stuff.
Exactly. There is nowhere to put it.
And you can't just truck it hundreds of miles away, right?
Yeah.
Because that just ruins the profit margin of the mine.
Precisely. It's all about economics. So the most economically efficient solution for the mining companies was to just pile it up on the hillsides directly above the pits.
Just build a mountain out of it.
Pretty much. And over half a century, the physical reality of the village of Aberfan was fundamentally altered by this process.
It's hard to even picture it.
Well, eventually, 7 massive tips of waste had slowly grown on the flank of Merthyr Mountain, just looming directly over the town.
And when we say tips, I think it's easy to picture like a large mound of dirt at a local construction site.
Oh, no.
We really need to scale this up for the listener. These were artificial mountains.
They completely dominated the skyline. Wow. For the children who were born and raised in Aberfan in the 1950s and 60s, these black mountains were just part of the local geography.
Right, like they didn't know anything else.
Exactly. They had absolutely no memory, no concept of a landscape without them. The unnatural had become completely normalized to them.
It's kind of like the boiling frog syndrome, but on a geological scale.
That's a great analogy, yeah.
When you grow up next to a sleeping hazard, your brain just categorizes it as scenery. It's just the background of your life.
Right. But let's zoom in on the specific hazard here, which was tip 7.
Okay, tip 7.
The dumping of tip 7 began in 1958, so it was the newest addition to the complex.
Got it.
But the geology beneath tip 7 is where this story goes from, an industrial eyesore to a lethal trap.
Right, because geology is everything here.
It really is.
Yeah.
The hillside beneath tip 7 wasn't solid, impermeable bedrock. It was highly porous sandstone.
Porous sandstone.
Yeah.
Meaning water can get through it.
Yes. And more importantly, this porous sandstone was heavily threaded with natural underground springs.
Oh.
So water was constantly moving through the rock directly beneath where they were dumping thousands upon thousands of tons of loose colliery spoil.
Wait. So they were building a massive waste tip over an active flowing underground spring.
Yes, they were.
That defies basic engineering. I mean,
It goes against everything.
But it's not just that the rock got wet and slippery, right? Our sources mention this term, liquefaction.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain what the water actually does to this specific kind of coal waste? Because I think that's crucial.
It is the absolute key to understanding this. Yes, liquefaction is the mechanism.
Okay.
When we think of a landslide, normally we usually think of solid rocks tumbling down a hill, like a dry avalanche.
Right, just gravity pulling rocks down.
Exactly. But colliery spoil, especially that fine slurry we talked about, behaves completely differently.
Because it's so fine.
Because of the particle size, yeah. When water from those springs pushes up into the tip, it fills the microscopic gaps between the individual particles of coal and shale.
Okay, I'm with you.
And as the water continues to pump into the pile, because remember, these springs are active, they're flowing, the water has nowhere to drain.
Right, it's just getting trapped inside this massive pile.
So the water pressure actually begins to push the solid particles apart.
Oh, wow.
This is a phenomenon known in engineering as poor water pressure.
Poor water pressure. Okay.
And it eventually reaches a critical threshold where the solid particles are literally no longer touching each other.
They're basically floating.
Yes, they were suspended in the water. And in an instant, the internal friction that holds the mountain together, the very thing keeping it a solid shape, drops to zero.
Okay, let me make sure I'm wrapping my head around this. So tipping colliery waste over a spring isn't just like building a house on a wet sponge.
No, it's far more dynamic than that.
It's like filling a massive silo with dry flour,
Yeah.
right? And then secretly pumping a fire hose into the bottom of it.
That is exactly it.
From the outside, the top looks dry and completely solid. But internally, it's becoming this highly pressurized bomb just waiting for the container to fail.
That is a highly accurate analogy. The structural integrity is a complete illusion.
That is terrifying. But wait, How could the engineers not know they were pumping the fire hose?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
I mean, how could they not know those springs were there before they even started dumping back in 1958?
This is where the historical record becomes profoundly damning.
Okay.
They did know.
They knew.
Yes. These natural springs weren't some hidden, secret subterranean feature that required, advanced seismic testing to locate.
Right, it wasn't a mystery.
Not at all.
Yeah.
They were clearly and explicitly marked on the standard Ordnance Survey maps of the area.
You mean the public maps?
Yes, the public maps. Ordnance Survey maps are the highly detailed standard topographical maps of Great Britain.
Anyone can get them.
Exactly. Anyone with even a basic understanding of map reading could just look at the chart for Merthyr Mountain, locate the perimeter of Tip 7, and see the blue lines indicating water sources right underneath it.
Glue lines are literally printed on the paper.
The water was a documented, published fact.
So the engineers at the National Coal Board, the state-run monolith that was responsible for all of this, they had the maps.
They definitely had the maps.
And they were actively piling millions of tons of waste on top of known mapped water sources.
Yes.
And from what I'm seeing in the sources, it wasn't just a quiet oversight either. The sources highlight a very specific paper trail from 1963.
That's right. 3 full years before the disaster.
3 years, people were actively looking at this and ringing the alarm bell.
The 1963 warnings are really pivotal here because the local authorities, specifically the local borough council engineer, were getting increasingly anxious about Tip 7.
Which is totally understandable given the geography.
Right, and they didn't just have vague concerns at some random town hall meeting. They put those fears in writing.
They made a paper trail.
They sent formal communications to the area management of the National Coal Board explicitly highlighting the danger.
What exactly did they say in these memos?
They pointed out 2 critical facts that, frankly, should have stopped operations immediately.
Okay.
First, they noted the very real, present danger of water accumulating in that specific waste tip.
So they saw the water issue.
Yes. And second, they pointed out the geography. Tip 7 was positioned directly above Pantglas Junior School.
They literally wrote it down. You were dumping a waterlogged hazard directly above a primary school.
They spelled it out as clearly as possible.
Looking at the response from the National Coal Board's regional management and these sources, and it's just a black hole.
There was essentially no meaningful response.
How do you get a memo like that and do nothing? How does a human being read that and just file it away?
Effectively, there were some meetings, right? Some reassurances were given that things were under control. They maybe discussed some minor surface drainage tweaks.
Surface drainage.
Right, completely missing the internal issue. But the tipping continued unabated. No fundamental reassessment of Tip 7's viability was ever undertaken.
It's maddening. It really is.
It is. But I think this is where we see the actual mechanics of systemic failure taking root.
What do you mean?
Well, like we said earlier, you don't have a cartoon villain sitting in a boardroom actively deciding to endanger a village.
Right.
Instead, you have a massive, slow-moving bureaucracy. And in that kind of system, responsibility is so heavily diffused that a glaring warning simply gets filed away.
Because no single person feels like it's their job to stop the train.
Exactly. The National Coal Board was an enormous nationalized entity. Its primary overriding directive was to keep the coal moving,
Get the quotas.
hit production quotas, keep the pits open. Anything that threatened that momentum, like a severe warning that might require halting production to move a tip, was instinctively minimized by the institutional culture.
It's the horrific inertia of large organizations.
Inertia is the perfect word for it.
It is always easier to do nothing, to just pass the memo to another desk, than to actually reach out and stop the machine. And that inertia brings us directly to the catalyst. The trap is officially set. The warnings are buried in some filing cabinet.
The waste is piling up over the springs.
And the pressure in our metaphorical flour silo is building. Which brings us to the autumn of 1966.
Right. The weather was the final variable here.
And South Wales is known for rain. But this was different, wasn't it?
It was. Leading up to late October, South Wales experienced days and days of incredibly heavy, persistent rain.
And this wasn't just surface water running off the sides of the mountain, right?
No, because of the geology.
Right. This rain was soaking deep into that porous sandstone we talked about.
Exactly. It was swelling those natural underground springs, forcing even more water up into the millions of tons of loose colliery spoil.
Silently.
Invisibly.
Invisibly. The interior of Tip 7 was crossing that exact threshold of poor water pressure we discussed earlier.
The friction was being systematically erased.
It was no longer a solid pile of rock. It was a massive, highly unstable reservoir of liquefied sludge. Which brings us to the morning it moved, October 21st, 1966.
Yes.
And I want to set the scene carefully here. The facts of this timeline are devastating. They require absolutely no embellishment. Our focus is strictly on the mechanics of the event and the community.
Absolutely. The raw timeline is powerful enough on its own.
It's a Friday. It's the final day before the school's half-term holiday.
Everyone knows that feeling.
Yeah, there's always that specific, restless, happy energy in a school on a Friday before a break. Kids are excited.
Right.
Down at the bottom of the mountain on Aberfan Road, Pantglas Junior School has just finished its morning assembly.
And the children are filing back into their individual classrooms for the first lessons of the day.
And I do want to address one detail here, just to ensure we are being totally factually rigorous with our sources.
I think I know what you're going to bring up.
If you've ever read about Aberfan or seen portrayals of it, you might have heard the story that the children had just finished singing the hymn All Things Bright and Beautiful right before the collapse.
Yes, that detail is very, very prevalent in the cultural memory of the event.
It's an incredibly potent image, the innocence of that song right before the tragedy. But the historical consensus from the sources we're looking at is that this detail is very thinly sourced.
Right.
It has become a kind of mythological shorthand for the tragedy. It's a way to emphasize innocence before destruction. But the reality is poignant enough. We really don't need the men.
No, we don't. And, it is a profound human instinct to try and find narrative poignancy in chaos, right? To overlay a cinematic meaning onto senselessness.
Definitely.
But sticking to the documented facts is crucial here.
So it's about 9:15 a.m. Up on the mountain, the tipping gang feels the ground drop. The phone wire is dead.
Yeah.
Tip 7 finally fails.
And when it failed, because of the total liquefaction we explained, it didn't behave like a rockfall.
It didn't just crumble.
No.
Yeah.
Roughly 150,000 cubic meters, which translates to around 150,000 tons of colliery spoil, broke loose all at once.
150,000 tons of liquid rock.
Yes. And as it accelerated down the steep gradient of Merthyr Mountain, it gathered devastating momentum.
Just picking up speed.
The geological surveys estimate that the wave of black sludge reached depths of roughly 12 meters.
Wait, 12 meters? That is about 40 feet high.
Yes.
That's a 4-story building of wet concrete moving down a mountain.
And moving far, far faster than any human being could possibly run.
It crossed the canal. It crossed the railway embankment, just completely wiping out the track.
Nothing could slow it down.
And at exactly 9:15 a.m., that wave slammed into Aberfan Overt. In its direct path, it swallowed 2 farm cottages, an entire row of terraced houses, and a significant portion of Pantglas Junior School.
The transition from a normal Friday morning to total devastation took less than 5 minutes.
Less than 5 minutes. And the immediate aftermath was characterized by something very specific, something that really haunts the survivor testimony.
Yes.
The silence.
Radio silence.
When you watch a disaster movie, the aftermath is always loud. Sirens, screaming, chaos, explosions.
Very noisy.
But what survivors and rescuers consistently recall about those first few minutes is an eerie, total suffocating silence.
It's hard to imagine.
The roar of the slide stopped, and then there was just nothing. Survivors reported that the sludge was so thick and so heavy, it absorbed all sound.
Like insulation.
Yeah. You couldn't hear birds.
Yeah.
And most terrifyingly, you couldn't hear any children.
That silence is the starkest indicator of the sheer density of the material. It just smothered everything.
Yeah.
To state the human cost plainly, as documented by the authorities, 144 people died that morning.
144.
116 of them were children, the vast majority aged between 7 and 10 years old.
Wow.
28 adults died, including 5 teachers who were with their classes.
Just doing their jobs.
Exactly. Over 100 children died in the junior school alone.
It's quite literally the erasure of a generation in a single moment.
It is.
But the community's response was instantaneous. The emergency whistle blew at the Merthyr Vale colliery, signaling a disaster. And miners quite literally dropped their tools underground. They rode the cages to the surface, and they ran straight off their shifts.
Didn't even stop to think.
You had hundreds of hardened industrial workers, still completely covered in coal dust, sprinting toward the school.
And they understood the material better than anyone on Earth.
Right, they work with it every day.
They knew exactly how heavy and unforgiving that slurry was.
So they dug frantically. They used shovels, they used buckets from the school kitchen.
Yeah.
And when they had absolutely nothing else, they dug into this dense, settling sludge with their bare hands,
tearing their fingernails apart.
working alongside frantic, terrified parents who were looking for their kids.
The frantic nature of that rescue effort is heartbreaking, especially when we look at the timeline established by the emergency services.
What does the timeline show?
Well, despite hundreds of people digging with everything they had, the very last survivor was brought out of the wreckage alive at 11:00 a.m.
Wait, 11 a.m., but the slide hit at 9.15.
Yes. Less than 2 hours later. I can't even fathom that. 2 hours.
The density of the slurry meant that if you were buried, there were almost no air pockets.
It just packed in around you.
Right, it set like concrete as the water drained out of it.
Oh, God.
So after 11:00 a.m., it was no longer a rescue mission.
The window had closed.
The horrible reality settled over the village that it was strictly a recovery mission. The frantic adrenaline of those first 2 hours calcified into a grim, protracted excavation of the dead that lasted for days.
The psychological weight of that shift is just staggering. Digging for days, knowing you are only going to find bodies.
It takes an unimaginable toll on a community.
And that collective community-wide grief culminated 6 days later on October 27th.
Right.
They held a joint funeral for the victims. Over 2,000 mourners stood on the hillside watching a heartbreakingly long line of small wooden coffins being buried together in massive trenches at Bryntaff Cemetery.
It is a visual that defined a nation's grief. I mean, those images were broadcast everywhere.
It really was. It was an incredible outpouring of national mourning. And I think it's also worth noting here, as many of our sources do, the timeline of the official state response.
Right, you're talking about the Queen's visit.
Yes.
Queen Elizabeth II visited Aberfan on October 29th, which was 8 days after the disaster.
Right.
And it's widely reported in biographies that she considered her delay in visiting to be one of her greatest personal regrets.
It's brought up often.
But the historians in our sources gently add some really vital context here.
Which is important to highlight.
While her regret is true, focusing solely on the monarch overshadows a much larger issue.
Exactly.
The slowness, the slight detachment in those early days was a systemic establishment issue, not just a royal one.
The entire apparatus of the state seemed sluggish to comprehend the scale of what had happened to this, working-class peripheral community.
It was in London, so it didn't register immediately.
Right. It took time for London to realize this wasn't just a localized mining accident, but a national catastrophe.
And a catastrophe that was completely preventable. You have a village that just buried a generation. Grief that heavy, combined with the knowledge of those ignored warnings we talked about, it doesn't just dissipate.
No, it hardens.
It turns into a fierce demand for accountability. The community of Aberfan demanded to know how this was allowed to happen.
Which forced the government's hand. They had to open a public inquiry.
Which brings us to the reckoning, or rather, the attempt at one.
Right. The government convened a tribunal chaired by a highly respected Welsh judge, Lord Justice Edmund Davies.
And this wasn't just a quick, superficial review, was it?
Oh, no. It was a massive, exhaustive undertaking.
The Davies Tribunal sat for 76 days.
76 days.
At the time, it was the longest such inquiry in British legal history.
Yeah.
They interviewed over 100 witnesses.
They combed through everything. The geological data, the internal communications of the coal board, the maps, the maintenance records.
They really dug in.
They reconstructed the entire bureaucratic failure step by step.
And when the tribunal finally published its report in August of 1967, the verdict they delivered was absolutely unflinching.
So there was zero ambiguity.
None. The report stated categorically that the disaster was entirely preventable, and that the blame rested solely and entirely upon the National Coal Board.
It's rare to get a government report that points the finger that directly at a state institution.
It really is. And there is one specific quote from the Davies Tribunal that our sources highlight, and it really serves as the defining thesis for this entire tragedy.
The signature quote from the tribunal report is this: "The disaster was caused by not villainy, but ignorance, ineptitude, and a failure in communications."
Ignorance, ineptitude, and a failure in communications.
Yeah.
In a way that's almost harder to swallow than malice.
How do you mean?
Well, if a cartoon villain purposefully blew up a dam, you could lock them away and feel a sense of justice. There's a bad guy, you put him in jail, case closed.
That makes sense.
But how do you lock away ineptitude?
You can't. It is deeply unsatisfying to the human desire for justice. It means the safeguards failed because the people operating them simply weren't paying attention.
Or they didn't care enough to follow up.
Or they couldn't effectively talk to one another across departmental lines. It's just a tragic failure of basic competence.
But while the tribunal was doing this diligent work, finding the truth, the behavior of the leadership of the National Coal Board outside the courtroom was a completely different story.
Oh, it certainly was.
We really need to talk about Lord Robbins.
Yes, Lord Robbins.
He was the chairman of the NCB at the time, essentially the CEO of this massive state monopoly.
Lord Alf Robbins was a very powerful figure, a former politician with immense influence.
And his handling of the crisis is, honestly, a masterclass in institutional self-preservation.
It's textbook crisis PR in the worst way.
I'm looking at his statements here in the sources, and it's infuriating.
Yeah.
So Lord Robbins, the man at the very top, speaks to the press just 2 days after the disaster.
2 days.
2 days. The village is still actively digging graves. And Robbins publicly claims that no one could have known there was a spring inside the tip.
Right.
He frames it to the media as an unforeseeable act of God, a freak geological anomaly that defeated their best engineering.
It was a very calculated statement.
Wait, I'm genuinely confused looking at this timeline.
Okay.
How can the head of the organization stand in front of microphones and say it was impossible to know about the water when we just established that the springs were literally printed in blue ink on the Ordnance Survey maps?
Maps they had.
Maps his own engineers possessed. Did he think people just wouldn't check?
Well, it's a classic crisis management tactic to
Okay.
deny predictability to avoid liability.
Deny predictability.
If it's an act of God, the NCB doesn't have to pay out massive damages or face structural overhaul.
Oh, I see.
And he likely assumed the sheer authority of his position would make the narrative stick. You know, I'm Lord Robbins, I'm telling you this is an act of God, end of story. Furthermore, it wasn't just an off-the-cuff remark to a reporter. The National Coal Board's legal team actually brought this defense into the tribunal.
You're kidding. They tried to argue that under oath.
For weeks.
Wow.
They aggressively clung to this natural, unforeseeable springs defense. They brought in experts to try and argue that the water was a hidden subterranean mystery that no reasonable engineer could have anticipated.
Despite the maps.
Despite the maps.
But the tribunal had the maps. The judge could literally look at the piece of paper and see the spring.
Exactly. It was a strategy of legal attrition.
Just wearing them down.
The NCB maintained this fiction under oath for weeks, forcing the grieving community to sit in a courtroom and listen to highly paid lawyers twist geological facts designed to absolve the board of killing their children.
That is psychological torture for those parents.
It was incredibly cruel. But the tribunal's counsel was relentless.
Good.
It wasn't until day 65 of the inquiry, under intense microscopic cross-examination, that the NCB's defense finally collapsed.
Day 65.
They were backed into a logical corner they couldn't escape, and they finally abandoned the defense and conceded the point.
They finally admitted it.
They admitted what the maps had shown all along. The water was known, the danger was understood, and the tip was built anyway.
Okay, so after 65 days of gaslighting the victims, the NCB finally admits fault.
Yes.
The Davies Tribunal publishes a massive report blaming them entirely. The ineptitude is laid bare for the whole country to see.
Right.
So naturally, you would assume heads rolled, right?
You would think so.
I mean, people went to jail, executives were fired, massive fines were levied. Tell me about the consequences.
This is perhaps the hardest fact of this entire deep dive.
Brace me.
After the longest inquiry in British history, after blame was declared incontestable and placed squarely on the National Coal Board,
Right.
not a single person was prosecuted.
One person.
Not one. No one faced criminal charges for the deaths of 144 people.
That's insane.
Furthermore, within the National Coal Board itself, no one was dismissed from their job.
Nobody was fired.
No one was demoted. No one lost a single penny of their corporate pension.
That is staggering. 144 people are dead because of documented ineptitude, and the machine just keeps humming along like nothing happened.
Pretty much.
Did Robbins at least resign?
Lord Robbins did eventually offer a resignation, largely as a political formality, but the government refused to accept it.
They refused it.
They cited his importance to the coal industry's transition, so he remained in his powerful position.
It's the ultimate demonstration of how a system protects itself.
It really is.
When negligence is distributed across a bureaucracy, a missed memo by this guy, an ignored map by that department, a delayed inspection by a third office, It becomes impossible to pin a single charge of manslaughter on a single individual.
The institution absorbs the blame.
But an institution cannot go to prison.
No, they can't.
Therefore, the victims are left completely without justice. The scales are just left broken.
And unfortunately, denying them justice was only the beginning.
Wait, it gets worse.
The sources detail how the establishment then went after their dignity and, incredibly, their money.
Oh my God.
We need to look at the financial aftermath. This is a period that historian Ian McLean refers to as the second disaster of Aberfan.
Okay, let's talk about the bill. What the village was forced to endure from 1968 onward.
Right.
First, let's look at the sheer indignity of the compensation process. When a massive institution is found entirely at fault for deaths, compensation is the standard legal remedy.
Right, it's how the system tries to make amends.
But the way the NCB handled it was just breathtakingly callous.
According to the archived records, which were unsealed years later, the families of the dead children were initially offered a flat figure of £500 per child by the National Coal Board.
£500. Even adjusting for inflation from 1966, that is a deeply insulting figure for the entirely preventable death of a 7-year-old child.
It's horrific.
And it gets worse. I'm reading the notes from McLean and Jonda's research, and they found internal memos from an NCB insurance officer who was actually working out these payouts.
Yeah, these memos are hard to read.
This officer described the £500 as a, quote, good offer.
The bureaucratic language is incredibly revealing. It's so transactional.
And hold on, it gets darker. When some families, who were understandably outraged by this, pushed back and asked for fair compensation or took legal counsel.
It says they're right.
Right. This same NCB officer referred to them in writing as a hardcore.
A hardcore.
As if grieving parents seeking accountability were some sort of militant, troublesome faction causing problems for the company's bottom line. I actually don't even know how to process that level of callousness.
It views the victims not as people who have suffered an unimaginable wrong, but as financial liabilities to be managed and minimized.
It's sickening.
It is the complete removal of humanity from the equation. But the bureaucracy found even more invasive ways to intrude on the community's grief.
How could they be more invasive?
This brings us to the Charity Commission.
Right. Because in the wake of the disaster, the public response was massive.
Overwhelming, really.
People around the world were heartbroken by the images on the news. They poured out their wallets. A public disaster fund was established, and it received nearly 90,000 individual donations, ultimately totaling around $1.75 million.
That's a huge sum of money for 1966.
Huge! And this was money given explicitly, voluntarily by the public to help the people of Aberfan rebuild their lives.
It was an incredible expression of collective empathy.
Definitely.
But public funds of that size in the UK are overseen by the Charity Commission.
Okay, that makes sense. You need oversight.
Right, and the Commission's role is to ensure the money is distributed according to charitable law. However, their interpretation of that law in this specific instance was astonishingly detached from reality.
They proposed a guideline that is just hard to read.
Go ahead.
The Charity Commission actually suggested that before bereaved parents could receive any payment from this public fund, they should have to formally prove that they had been close to their dead children.
They wanted to establish that the parents were genuine dependents or had suffered a quantifiable loss beyond just emotional grief.
What does that even mean?
It's a standard metric in some legal payouts, like if an adult provider dies.
But entirely inappropriate for a disaster relief fund meant to comfort bereaved parents of 7-year-olds.
Exactly.
Think about the logic there for a second. A government commission wanted parents to prove, through some sort of bureaucratic metric or interview, that they loved their dead child enough to warrant a charity payout.
It's grotesque.
It's like they were treating the loss of a child as a suspicious insurance claim.
It is the absolute apex of bureaucratic detachment, where human emotion and catastrophic loss are reduced to a verifiable metric on a standard form.
Did they actually go through with it?
Fortunately, no. The trustees of the Aberfan Disaster Fund, which were the local people and officials actually managing the money on the ground, they flatly refused this demand from the Charity Commission.
Thank goodness.
They recognized the inherent cruelty and pushed back hard, ensuring the money was distributed without that horrifying caveat.
Thank goodness for the local trustees.
Truly.
But that brings us to the most enraging part of this entire story. The final unforgivable wound inflicted on Aberfan.
The raid on the disaster fund.
The raid.
So in 1968, the village was facing another severe crisis.
What was happening?
Well, the disaster had involved tip 7, right? But as we discussed earlier, there was an entire complex of tips on that mountain.
Oh, right. There were 7 of them total.
Exactly. There are still massive NCB waste tips looming over the village, and understandably, the survivors were terrified.
I would be too.
Every time it rained, parents panicked. They demanded that all the remaining tips be removed immediately.
The government agreed they had to go, right?
They did. But then the question arose, who pays for the massive engineering project to remove millions of tons of waste?
And this is where the story pivots from negligence to outright extortion.
It really does.
Let's lay out the facts here clearly, because the logic is maddening.
Let's hear it.
The remaining tips belong to the National Coal Board.
Yes.
The NCB created them.
Yes.
The Davies Tribunal had just confirmed that the way the NCB built these tips violated their own safety rules.
Correct.
So it is their waste, their hazard, their legal fault.
Entirely.
Yet the government, under financial pressure, turned to the Aberfan Disaster Fund, the $1.75 million in charity money donated by the public for the victims. And they pressured the local trustees to hand over £150,000 to help pay the NCB's bill to remove the NCB's own dangerous tips.
It is a stunning inversion of responsibility.
It makes no sense.
The government, essentially working in tandem with the NCB to save face and save money, used a horrific implicit threat.
What was the threat?
The message was essentially, if the fund doesn't contribute this £150,000, we can't guarantee the tips will be removed quickly,
Wow.
leaving the village in perpetual fear of a second slide.
They held a gun to their heads.
They did, and under extreme duress, desperate to ensure the physical safety of whatever children they had left, the trustees capitulated. They handed over the £150,000.
So the bereaved people of Aberfan were forced to use their own charity money to pay a negligent corporation to remove the mountains that still threatened to kill them.
That is exactly what happened.
It is quite literally making the victim pay for the bullet.
It was a profound moral failure by the government of the day. And it wasn't just morally wrong, it was legally highly dubious.
I was going to ask, is that even legal?
Well, decades later, the Charity Commission itself, the very regulator that should have protected the fund from government raiding in 1968, reviewed the historical case.
Why, what do they say?
They explicitly called that extraction of funds unquestionably unlawful. The government had absolutely no legal right to take charity money to fulfill a corporate liability.
So they unlawfully took £150,000 from victims. Did they ever get it back?
They did, eventually, but the timeline is agonizingly slow. It took 30 years of campaigning by the survivors. The £150,000 was finally repaid to the fund in 1997 by the then Welsh Secretary, Ron Davies.
30 years. And I assume there's a catch, because there always is in this story.
There is. When the government finally repaid the money in 1997, they only repaid the principal amount of £150,000.
You've got to be kidding me.
They did not include 30 years of compound interest, nor did they adjust it for 30 years of inflation.
That's ridiculous.
In real economic terms, what was returned was a mere fraction of the purchasing power that was taken in 1968.
Just a final insult tacked onto a restitution.
It wasn't until a full decade after that, in 2007, at the National Assembly for Wales finally recognized this enduring insult.
Did they fix it?
They offered a fuller, more restorative gesture of around $1.5 million to the Aberfan Memorial Charity, acknowledging the lost interest and the profound wrong that had been done.
40 years to get the money back with something resembling fairness.
40 years.
It's exhausting just to trace the timeline. Through all of this misery, the negligence, the gaslighting, the extortion, did anything durable or positive actually come from this? Did the law change to stop it from happening again?
Yes, there was one significant piece of durable change.
Why? Good.
In 1969, Parliament passed the Mines and Quarries Tips Act.
What did that do?
Well, prior to Aberfan, there was virtually no cohesive national legislation governing the safety, placement, or structural integrity of colliery spoil tips.
Which is wild, considering they were building artificial mountains above towns.
Right. They were treated merely as operational byproducts.
Yeah.
They existed outside the strict safety regulations that governed the underground mines themselves.
So they were basically unregulated.
The 1969 Act changed that entirely. It brought the tips under strict regulatory oversight. It mandated rigorous geological surveys before tipping could begin, required engineered drainage plans, and instituted regular safety inspections across all of Britain. It fundamentally changed the safety landscape of mining areas and almost certainly prevented future landslides.
Which is objectively good and saved lives later on, but it just leaves such a bitter taste.
It does. And this raises a critical point about how modern societies function, one that applies far beyond mining or 1960s Britain.
What is that?
Why are our safety laws almost always written in the past tense of a tragedy?
Right, it's the tombstone mentality of regulation.
Exactly. Why does it take 144 deaths to mandate a geological survey that everyone already knew was basic common sense?
Especially when they already had the maps.
The legislative legacy of Aberfan is undeniable, but it is entirely reactive. The regulations were built only after the graves were dug.
We only write the rules on the headstone to the victims.
Unfortunately, yes.
And that brings us to where we are today, looking at the echoes of this event. If you go to Aberfan now, the physical landscape has completely changed.
It's very different.
The Black Mountains are gone. Where Pantglas Junior School once stood, the building has been erased, and in its place is a beautiful, very quiet memorial garden.
It's a very moving space.
And if you look up on the hillside at Bryntaff Cemetery, the graves of the victims stand in these long, stark, beautiful white ajas. It is a place of profound peace now.
But that piece is hard-won, and the historical lesson of how it came to be is violently uncomfortable.
Because the core theme we've been uncovering, the danger of Tip 7, was never a secret.
No, never.
It was always visible to anyone who looked at the mountain. It was mapped out by ordnance surveyors years in advance.
Marked in blue ink.
It was written down in formal memos by local authorities 3 years prior. Aberfan wasn't a tragedy that caught the world by surprise like a sudden earthquake or a meteor strike.
Right.
It was a tragedy that the system, the establishment, and the world allowed to happen anyway, because acting on the warnings was deemed too difficult, too costly, or too inconvenient for the bureaucracy.
That is the ultimate summary thought here. The physical mountain of Tip 7 was eventually dismantled and removed.
The immediate hazard was erased.
But the deeper systemic mountain, the culture of institutional evasion, the prioritizing of bureaucratic momentum over human safety, and the stark reality that systems will instinctively protect themselves before they protect the vulnerable, that is a lesson society seems doomed to keep learning the hard way.
Over and over.
The accountability we expect from our institutions is rarely freely given. It usually has to be wrenched from them over decades.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a question to ponder. We started by picturing those men on the foggy mountain, watching a disaster begin, fully aware of the danger, but totally powerless to stop it because the warning systems had been stripped away and ignored.
Right.
Look around at the systems you rely on in your own life, your community, your country. What mountains are currently growing over our heads right now?
It's a sobering thought.
What systemic dangers are documented in obscure reports, visible on the data maps, entirely known to the people in charge, but are being ignored for the sake of convenience or profit?
What's the next Tip 7?
Exactly. What disasters are just waiting for their catalyst, their own few days of heavy rain, to bring them down on us? Keep your eyes open, stay curious, and never stop questioning the structures that promise to keep you safe.